Well, hey everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health one topic at a time. So guys, today I want to talk about something like entirely new. I actually put something on the Facebook group about it just a short while ago. It was that I started getting into making sourdough, and some of you have been following me for a while know that I'm gluten-free. So there are some added challenges if you're going to make gluten-free sourdough, and that I've been doing. And I'll talk about it more. I don't want to be too broad because there's just plenty of people out there who are experts in this. I'm definitely not one of them. I'm really new to this. I am having some success, but I said that I would do a video just talking about a couple of things that I've learned pertinent to gluten-free sourdough especially. And there were a couple of things that really started to help me in terms of my success. So I just want to talk about what a couple of those things were and see if it helps you guys. If you're making sourdough with glutinous flour, like with regular bread flour, even whole wheat flour, I think you add gluten when you're making bread. That's a whole different thing because what gluten does is it adds an elasticity to dough. Sourdough is it's what bread was before we had commercial yeast. Okay, sourdough is making a starter culture of wild yeast so that you're not buying those packets of commercial yeast and adding that and having something rise quickly. And it's back in the day when people made bread, it's actually a fermented food. They fermented a little bit of the flour, and that was called the starter. And once they got that wild yeast active in the starter and it was nice and active and bubbling, that would tell you that it's time that you can bake bread with it, because when you mix that into the dough, it feeds on the dough. It gives off carbon dioxide just as a byproduct of metabolism, and the carbon dioxide forms the bubbles in dough that you see in bread. And that's where the gluten comes in really handy, because gluten gives dough an elasticity. So as bubbles form, the dough can stretch. It can stretch like this and have little balloons in it essentially. Gluten-free dough doesn't have quite that stretch. There are some hacks for it, but gluten-free dough is at much greater risk to, as the bubbles are forming, break, right? Because it doesn't have the stretch to it. So it's a big challenge. And sometimes you have to decide perfect is the enemy of good. You're not going to get quite as much rise as you would get with a gluten counterpart, and you're just going to be content with that because you'd rather that than fail. So I did learn a couple of things pertinent and things that helped me with my making gluten-free sourdough bread, which is going pretty good. And I think I'm going to be doing this now pretty regularly. I've got a very active starter. So let me begin with that. I was told to stick with brown rice starter, and that's sort of what people use. Like it's the first go-to in terms of a starter if you want to start a gluten-free starter. And starter is just a mixture of flour and water that will then cultivate wild yeast for it to feed on, and then that becomes your quote unquote yeast for your bread baking. And what you do is every time you make a loaf, you use, that's my Instant Pot. I've made yogurt. Every time you use some of it to make a loaf of bread, and then you reserve just enough so that you can keep feeding it, so that then you'll have some for the next time. And there's other ways to do that as well. But anyway, brown rice is what people say is the easiest, and that's what they start with. And I failed a few times with brown rice. I don't know how this was possible, because everybody said that's the easiest thing to do. And it always looked like right away, like it was starting up, like it actually would start to bubble, like sometimes before 24 hours. And what I learned later is that sometimes it's still active. It kind of gets lazy for a few days, and if you stick with it and keep at it, it will ultimately become a good starter. But I didn't have much luck with brown rice flour, and I'm usually hungry for some success pretty quickly. So I had heard that teff is another really good one, and buckwheat. I had heard buckwheat is excellent, but that it's more finicky. Well, don't tell that to my buckwheat flour. I have a buckwheat starter that just won't quit. I mean, now I'm offering to give it away to friends because I'm having to waste it every time I feed it. So I'm actually trying to just make more bread with it. But I found the buckwheat starter to be very complex. And actually, when I first started it, I did it as a proportion. I did it part brown rice and part buckwheat. I think I did it like 3/4, 1/4, and then I continued to feed it that way. And then now I notice that when I take a little bit out and I feed it, like I'm ready to get ready to make bread with it, I can feed it all buckwheat and it'll still do just fine. So I had to make that transition kind of slowly. But for me, buckwheat just did wonders, and it just made that nice spongy texture that you're supposed to look for. It's actually, kind of solid. It's not really thin like pancake batter, but that's another point I'm going to get to in a moment. But it did give those bubbles and that nice spongy texture when you stir it and you go to like scrape the surface and you can see all the bubbles underneath. And I've just had excellent luck with buckwheat flour. Now, one thing I wondered is maybe it was because my brown rice flour was not organic and my buckwheat flour is organic. So I wonder if that might have had something to do with it. Perhaps the organic is, has more plentiful wild yeasts and things on the grains. That's very possible. So anyway, I recommend using buckwheat flour. I had a great experience, and it did also bubble up right away, like less than 24 hours, and it just never stopped. It was within less than a week. It was growing in size and sufficient enough to bake with, and I didn't even think that was remotely possible. So I thought it was just maybe it's immature and it's not going to be. It's not going to be doing that every time. Like it's not going to have the consistent, behavior. But I went ahead and baked with it. It was less than a week and it did very well. So yeah, buckwheat flour for starter. As far as consistency, I don't see anybody saying this out on social media or anywhere I looked for information on how to do this. But I realize now that sometimes I threw out what I thought was a failed brown rice starter, and in fact it wasn't. Because after a certain number of days, once it starts fermenting, they say it's supposed to almost double in size. Gluten-free grains won't quite double like glutinous grains for the reason I described earlier, but it should noticeably get bigger. Well, yeah, except for the fact that when they tell you to make this like thin, like kind of slightly thickened pancake batter, and people show you on like when you watch videos of this and they take pictures of it pouring, what I realized is that when it's that liquidy, any bubbles that are forming aren't really getting trapped under there like they might with a glutinous flour. And I think what was going on with my brown rice flour is that sometimes I really didn't have a failure, but the bubbles were forming, but they were coming up to the top and breaking, so it didn't appear to be multiplying in size exponentially. It'd be interesting for me to go back and do the same thing again and just use it anyway. When it's bubbling, it's happy. If it's bubbling, it's fermenting. If it has that pleasant sour smell, it's ready. I probably should have just tried it. But I realized that you just can't expect bubbles to remain trapped under a liquidy surface where there's no gluten for elasticity to contain them. So what I did when I went to the buckwheat flour, so see, I have two variables now. I didn't only change the flour. I used the measurements by weight, sort of. I added a little bit more water usually because buckwheat kind of is a pretty thirsty flour, but I didn't get it to pancake pouring like consistency. I actually kept it at a very thick consistency, and I think that's what helped to make it so that the bubbles were trapped and it actually pushed itself up in the jar. And I showed pictures on the Facebook group of it growing. And I just think that I think staying true to the weights, not measures by volume, but roughly weights. I think people who are really experienced at this don't need to do that. I probably wouldn't need to do that pretty soon because I know the consistency that it took for me to get a good starter. But if you look at roughly weights, like equal parts flour, equal parts water in ounces or grams, you'll get a very different consistency than if you're using equal parts volume, like a half cup of each. And it's quite a bit drier with the gluten-free flour, and I kind of think it needs to be that way. It needs to be a little bit of a stiffer batter, or perhaps you need to go ahead and use it if it's nice and bubbly, even if it's not growing. When it's in a larger dough overall, the bread dough will trap it. I haven't tried that for myself, but that's a second issue I learned. Don't worry about the consistency. Go ahead and let it be thicker if it is a gluten-free starter. The next thing I learned is that your flour blend is really important, and I already knew this because I've had extensive experience making different kinds of gluten-free things, including some breads with gluten-free flour blends. And I'm going to go ahead here and give a plug to another YouTube content creator because there is no gluten-free flour blend like hers. Now, her channel is not devoted to overall health. There's a lot of stuff in there that I don't want to make because it's a lot of sweets and cookies and cinnamon rolls. I have tried some of them and they're wonderful, but she has really nailed it on the flour mixtures. She has several different flour blends, and I would be very surprised if she doesn't end up with her own products where somebody picks her up and packages those flour blends so that she can sell them commercially. Um, I think what's different is that for her gluten-free flour blends, at least in the bread blends, very often bread ends up very hard and dense and kind of brick-like, and you're never going to get it really light and airy like bread with gluten. But her blend is different than anybody else's because she puts some amount of protein powder in it. Sometimes she uses whey powder. I have substituted it with a different protein powder that's non-dairy, and I get great results. And if anybody's interested, I'll show you which product I've used. But I think it's because she has the protein in there. Now, when you're going to make breads, even gluten-free breads and even whole grain breads, you still need some starches. So the gluten-free breads always have some tapioca starch, potato starch, or both. I try to stay away from recipes that call for cornstarch. So she actually has a couple of different bread flour blends. And one of them is not particularly healthy. It's a whole lot of the starches and some white rice flour, which I don't use. I've substituted that with brown rice flour, super fine ground, and had it very, very good results. But she now has a blend that's a whole grain blend, and it's gluten-free whole grains, and you use things. I don't use oats. She has oat flour in there. I use teff, quinoa, all kinds of things in there, and it is a wonderful blend. Again, it has the protein powder. So that is Kim at Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cake. So she has a blog, and then she also has a YouTube channel, Kim at Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cakes. It's called Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cake, but her name is Kim. So hats off to her. She has really cracked the code. And yeah, so it's very important which blends you start. So there's another YouTube channel that does a lot of like vegan baking and sourdough baking. And I learned some on that channel about just making sourdough starters, although the amounts are just huge than the recipe they give you and you just waste a lot. But they, again, when you're dealing with a gluten-free flour blend, even the best of blends, it's going to end up kind of hard and brick-like. I think that the addition of some protein powder in that mix really makes a difference and makes it more like a wheat blend of gluten-free flour. So I am now using the whole grain blend that Kim has designed at Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cake, and I'm using that in any gluten-free bread recipe I find for my sourdoughs, and I absolutely love it. I also realized how I always knew I liked sourdough, but I just love that sour flavor and the sour smell. I love it so much better than like commercially prepared yeasted breads. It's kind of a time commitment when you're going to go ahead and do it, but it's so paid off. So I'm just going to show you. This is day old, okay? So that's just the way it goes. I mean, I'm not going to eat a loaf of bread a day. So it's kind of gotten kind of moist because I put it into a plastic bag overnight. But this is one wedge, and this is it's a seeded whole grain bread recipe from Kim at Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cake. And you can see, I'm trying to get the camera to focus, but I guess it's not wanting to focus really well on that. But you can see I've got a lot of bubbles in that dough. It is kind of a dense bread, but it still has some give. Now, right out of the oven, the crust is nice and hard, and you can like hear it when I slice it. But when I wrap it up in plastic, what's left, we ate a lot of it yesterday, but now it's gotten a little bit soft in the crust. The smell is amazing. There's a seed soak in that recipe, so there's lots and lots of seeds and whole grains in there, and it's just a great product all the way around. So I'm really happy with it, and I want to thank Kim for that. And then finally, the last thing I learned is it seems like there's a lot of waste when you're first learning to put together a gluten-free starter. When you're just working on the starter, first of all, start several of them because, when one fails, it's so disappointing, like if you're a few days in. So start a few of them, but start them with really low amounts. Don't do this like where somebody says put a half a cup of flour and a half a cup of water. And again, don't use it in cups anyway. Use grams or ounces, okay, because it should be by weight. And then you have to sometimes adjust it the tiniest bit. Again, I don't get it to pourable consistency with gluten-free. That's just what works for me. But use really small amounts, okay? Once it starts bubbling and it gets active, and then you're going to feed it a little more and a little more, but you won't be wasting so much because at some point you do have to waste before you feed it because you always have to feed it its same weight. Okay, so, if you had a pound of this stuff, you'd have to feed it another pound of flour and another pound of water to keep that amount fed. So you will ultimately start wasting it, start using it hopefully, but start with just little tiny amounts. So that way you're not just wasting so much. And if it fails, it fails. Then, you start a few of them, have them like in little glass jars on the counter and just try a few and see how you do and see what works for you. It's also maybe nice to have different ones because they'll have different flavors. So far, this buckwheat one is the only one that's worked so well for me, so I'm just sticking with it, and I'm using buckwheat starter in anything I make, no matter what the flavor profile. Like this bread doesn't have any buckwheat flour in it at all, but it's leavened with the buckwheat starter, so it's fine. It's a nice complex flavor, and I really like it. So let me know if any of you have done sourdough. I did get a little discussion from a couple of people in the Facebook group. It's really good for you. I really do have an appreciation for all things fermented. And one thing I notice is that when I do eat this, unlike when I eat other breads, I try not to eat a lot of bread anyway, because for gluten-free diet, it's just better to stay away from things instead of all these substitutes. But nonetheless, sometimes you get like kind of a heavy or bloated feeling, and I think that with the fermentation helps break down some of the stuff that's harder to digest. And I just don't feel that way when I eat this bread. I feel like pleasantly full if I eat enough of it, but I don't feel like it's really that challenging to my digestion. And I'm just really enjoying it, and so is my husband. So all right, let me know if you guys are doing anything like that, and let me know your thoughts if you head on over to Let Them Eat Gluten Free Cake. And until next time, be well. Bye bye.